All right, imagine for a second that you're waking up. Your eyes are incredibly heavy, your limbs just flat out refuse to move, and your very last clear memory is driving down a pitch-black, isolated road. And now you find yourself flat on your back on a cold metal table. You are a specimen. The cold metal beneath you, the humming silence in the air, that faint, sterile scent that definitely doesn't belong on Earth. You're waiting. Your mind races because you suddenly realize you're captive inside a craft. You are acutely aware that you are being watched from the shadows. Okay, let's dive into this. To understand what might actually step out of that darkness next, we've got to look objectively at the source material. Over the decades, thousands of people have sat exactly where you are right now. By examining their cases, we can decode the methods, the motives, and the terrifying realities of the abduction phenomenon. File 1. Missing time and medical intrusions. We'll start with the most prevalent, and honestly, the most deeply psychological trauma found in the archives. Where did the time go? Think about that for just a second. The absolute, isolating terror of realizing that hours of your life have literally just been erased, stolen from you. Your own mind seamlessly joins events together just to block out the sheer horror of what actually occurred in that interim. And this brilliantly illustrates the anatomy of an abduction. We're looking at the famous 1961 Betty and Barney Hill case here, which really defined this chronological nightmare. First, you've got minutes of unease as they were shadowed by a soundless light while driving from Canada down to New Hampshire. Then, the jarring realization of hours of missing time the moment they arrived home. Over the following weeks, agonizing nightmares of humanoid figures started surfacing. And finally, months later, hypnotic regression unlocked the repressed memory of being taken aboard a craft for clinical experimentation. The sources most commonly describe the beings responsible for these medical intrusions as the Greys. Listen to this chilling, detached quote from the files describing their penetrating gaze. They're just big, real pretty circles, very smooth and don't blink. The light's so bright it hurts their eyes. They're completely clinical, utterly detached, bug-eyed and dwarfish. So the crucial point is that the terror of this missing time trope relies completely on the loss of control and, of course, memory. The victim is paralyzed, often reporting telepathic communication, while placed on a table for highly invasive procedures. And researchers suspect a very specific motive here based on the files: the harvesting of human genetics, and even the extraction of our intense emotional responses to somehow revitalize their own impoverished species. The cosmic warming. But hey, as you're laying there in that humming silence, waiting, realize that not all encounters in the files follow that clinical, violent pattern. Imagine the door opening, and instead of a dwarfish, insect-like entity, the figure that steps through looks entirely human, perfect, beautiful even. This is the unnerving reality of the second trope. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer visual and behavioral contrast between these entity profiles. On the one hand, you have the Greys, nighttime trauma, medical probes, the whole shebang. On the other hand, we have a phenomenon straight out of the 1950s known as the Space Brothers. The sources report these entities as being very human-like, often sporting long blonde hair. And they didn't abduct people in the dead of night, they actually held friendly meetings out in isolated deserts. The files detail the experiences of contactees, like George Van Tassel at a giant rock in California, and their overarching message: it wasn't biological harvesting at all. They were, quote, gravely concerned with our atom bombs. Their primary goal, seemingly, was to warn humanity of apocalyptic nuclear destruction. The recurring traits of this morning trope are absolutely fascinating. The entities strongly urge their human contacts to spread a message of peace and disarmament. But why? Well, the historical sources introduce a pretty wild theory. What if they aren't actually extraterrestrial at all? Some researchers suggest these beings might actually be cryptoterrestrials, basically an ancient earthbound sister species with a dwindling gene pool. In this theory, they disguise themselves as omnipotent space brothers, using that prudent disguise to manipulate our actions, because they know full well that if we trigger a nuclear war, they're going to be annihilated right alongside us. File 3. The invulnerable siege. But what if their motives are neither clinical nor diplomatic? What if the door to your examination room is literally ripped off its hinges and you are suddenly plunged into pure, unadulterated chaos? You cannot fight them. That is the stark, terrifying reality of the third trope. No matter what weapons you bring to bear, your resistance is utterly futile. Let's move to and see how this builds, looking at the agonizingly paced terror of the 1955 Hopkinsville encounter. It all began with small, silvery creatures slowly approaching a rural farmhouse in the dark. The Sutton and Taylor families were understandably terrified, and they opened fire. But here's the crazy part. Shotgun blasts at point-blank range didn't kill the beasts. It merely caused them to do a backflip and scurry away completely unharmed. The siege escalated as the entities attacked from the roof, literally reaching down with a clawed hand to seize a victim's hair. Finally, completely out of ammunition and hope, the terrified families abandoned their home and fled into the night. The high strangeness of this goblin-like siege trope is just off the charts. The entities are described with long arms, glowing yellow eyes, and this bizarre, unnatural pivoting gait. When they were shot right off the roof, they didn't fall. They floated to the ground. They represent an invulnerable, entirely chaotic threat. And perhaps the strangest trait of all is the official reaction. The files note that the Air Force dismissed this entire terrifying ordeal with a completely ridiculous explanation, claiming the families had merely been attacked by escaped, silver-painted circus monkeys. Yeah, you heard that right. Synthesis awaiting the door. So, we return to the present moment, the cold examination table, the humming machinery. You are no longer just a terrified victim waiting in the dark. You are now informed. This framework neatly categorizes the terrifying diversity of the unknown that we found in the files. If it's the Greys, you face a memory-wiping abduction driven by biological harvesting. If it's the Space Brothers, you might be dealing with disguised crypto-terrestrials delivering a desperate cosmic warning. And if it's the Goblins, like at Hopkinsville, you are facing a chaotic, invulnerable siege that just flat-out defies all human logic and physics. And if you're feeling alone right now on that metal table, consider this number. 1,500. That is the number of humanoid encounters assembled in early databanks by researchers decades ago. 1,500 people who felt that exact same cold metal, that same humming silence, and that same absolute loss of control. You are far from the first. You know the traits, you know their methods, you know the suspected motives from the files. So, as the humming silence breaks and the shadows begin to shift in your peripheral vision, if the door opens right now, which one will walk through?